All right, today we're going to move on to the next step, step 2 of the PID tuning principles. On this step, we're going to tune the main PID controller. The key here is realizing that the relationship between the D term and the P term is not just arbitrary. There is a ratio between the two. As the P term pushes the quad, the D term is fighting against any motion to push it and also countering to make sure that there's no overshoot. So we're trying to figure out what that ratio is. We're trying to tune that ratio. In this step, we're going to turn off some of the advanced PID control features. A lot of the functionality in Betaflight 4.0 that you see, like feed forward, absolute control, integrated yaw, even I-term relax, D-min, those are all what I would call advanced PID control features. They take the PID loop and they do additional things that we can do to increase flight performance. You know, the PID loop, it only goes so far. When the developer of the PID loop first envisioned it, they were thinking about controlling valves and things. Now, it works great. I've not seen anything work better than a PID loop thus far. I don't know of any other firmware that uses anything but a PID loop, even if they say they don't. Even if any firmware says they don't use the PID loop, but then you have D gains and P gains, that's a sign that they use the PID loop. So the PID loop is a great piece of how to operate anything, but you can do some additional things to it. And in Betaflight, that's what feed forward is and some of these other values. Nevertheless, we want to turn those off to get the P and D ratio, but we do want to let I-term relax turned on, so we're going to keep that on. So for this step, we're going to grab this content down below, and we're just going to copy this. We're going to bring that into the Betaflight configurator. You can see there's feed forward values, D-mins turned on. These are all the default settings. We're going to go into the CLI, we're going to come down to here, and we're going to hit paste, and then just hit enter. Now, of course, we're going to make sure we type in save and enter after we do that. That reboots the flight controller. We're going to go ahead and hit connect again, go into PID tuning, and we're going to look to make sure it took. All our feed forward values should be 0. All our D-min values should be 0 here for the gains. That shuts off D-min, so these are our D gains. And then all these, like the feed forward transition, absolute control, they're all turned off. I do keep I-term relax on because the I-term, when you're not tuned to follow set point very well, the I-term starts to accumulate because there's a lot of lag in the gyro following the set point, so it starts to accumulate. I-term relax prevents that from occurring. It detects that you're in a sharp move, and it uses the PID theory fundamental called I-term clamping to recognize that and stop the I-term from accumulating. And once we have that P/D ratio, we will do nothing after this to change that. That's a fundamental ratio between the two that's specific to each quad. The defaults in Betaflight and other firmwares might work better with some quads than other quads on that ratio. Maybe the defaults are close to the ratio that your quad happens to be, so then the defaults fly great. Maybe they're not, so then the defaults don't fly that great. So it's finding your specific quad's ratio, and it has to do with, do you have a GoPro, do you have a RunCam 5 on it, which is lighter, what's your batteries, is it 6S, 4S, is it a 3-inch, is it a 7-inch, there's so many variables, the motors, the props, all these things come into play. So we're going to go out right now, we're going to do some sharp flips and rolls, and then we're going to go bring that back in, look at the black box, look at what bounce back looks like. So let's have some more fun than sitting in front of this computer, and let's go out and actually fly.
Okay, the key part is to realize that what your D terms are set to is completely arbitrary. You could start with D terms at 30s or 20s or 40s. It doesn't really matter. We're going to adjust the P term, and it's the ratio between the two that counts. So I'm going to just fly some line of sight flips and rolls here. I'm going to keep it basic so you can see what the default PIDs in Betaflight look like. Then we're going to land it and start bumping up the P term. What you're going to see is that if your P to D ratio is off, in either case you get bounce back. If your P term's too high, you're going to get sharp, fast bounce back. If your P term's too low, you're going to get really slow bounce back because the I term is actually taking over because P term's not getting the job done. So let's see what the Betaflight defaults look like. Okay, so now I've taken the D term on both axes, taken it up to 50, and the P term down to 30. So you can see what too much D term looks like and too little P term looks like. Hopefully you could see there that the bounce back was soft. That's because the P term wasn't getting the job done. There was a lot of PID error because the gyro was not following set point very well. So the I term took over to push the quad into arresting the flip, and then that I term accumulates. Now I've taken both P terms up to 90 on both pitch and roll, and taken the D terms for both axes down to 30, so you can see what too much P term looks like in the P to D ratio. Okay, so after going through this, you can see that it's really the ratio between the two that matters. So you really set your D term at whatever gains you want. And that's really based on how much filtering and how aggressive you want to be against prop wash. So I usually like to have a little bit higher D term. I think the 30s is a good start, Betaflight default, without D-min, because that takes them down to like the 20s. So I usually take off D-min or put the 30s down in the D-min. So 30s to start, 35, 38. I usually like in the 40s somewhere. 50 is kind of pushing it. Obviously, if you have more D-term filtering or the vibrations on the quad are a little bit less, then you can up those gains and it pushes back a little bit better against prop wash. So anyways, with that, I've determined the ratio by going through different things. Going to set my D terms at 45, which puts the P on roll at 84 and the P on pitch at 68. So that was the ratio between the two, 45s on D term and then those two different P terms for pitch and roll. So we're going to do a quick one on that and you can see what that looks like. So in doing this P term to D term ratio, you can use Blackbox, you can just do it line of sight with looking at the quad. You can't really see the fast bounce back though with line of sight. I would say the best is FPV goggles or going back and reviewing HD. The quickest thing I would say is you do it with FPV goggles on, right? You just keep moving the P term, you pick a D term. You just keep moving the P term up until you start to see quick bounce backs. And then you just back off a little bit. I personally would log it at that point and then take the log back in and put it through some PID toolbox and some other things. So let's go look at what do some of these logs look like so you can see why in either case with a high P term or a high D term, why do you get bounce back in either case? One's just rapid and one's just soft.
Okay, so before we get into it, I did a video on Betaflight Blackbox Explorer, some of the bells and whistles, and I also talked about the PID loop and how the PID loop works with different terms and talked about the trace template setups and everything. So I'm on trace setup 9, and then after I'm going into 9, I'm clicking on here, and then I'm just going in and cleaning it out a little bit, turning off the gyro scale. I'm going to make this a little thicker so I can really see this line. But essentially what happens with your P to D ratio being too low, essentially you have too little P term and too much D term, that means that any movement, the D term's fighting it. So what happens? That means you get a ton of PID error. You get a ton of delay. See that gap here? This gyro should really be following this green line in the ideal scenario. So that starts to get a lot of error, and then the I term relax, kind of shuts off at some point, and I term starts to accumulate because there's so much gap here. There's so many milliseconds of delay. And that becomes the pushing term. It's almost like the I term kind of says, look, P term, if you're not going to get it done to arrest this roll, I'll jump in and get it done, so we'll start to arrest the roll. However, the problem with the I term taking on that roll, as you can see, is the P term, just how it works, is proportionally offset to the PID error, that as the gyro comes down and hits set point, P term also comes down to 0, and they're both crossing exactly at the same spot here. That's not how the I term works. So you can see the I term is continuing to say, no, keep coming, keep coming. Oh, we passed the set point, and then it starts to reverse itself over time, and that's what causes this I term induced bounce back. So as you get too much D term and too little P term, or your P to D ratio is low, P over D, that means you will start to get this really soft I term induced bounce back. So you got to kind of look for that. If you're having real soft bounce back like we showed, a lot of people say, oh, if you have bounce back, increase D term. That's not true. If you keep increasing D term, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. So now let's look at the other end of the spectrum. This is where we have P term now set to 120. So let's go look here. We have 120 for P term and 30 for D term. So this is the P to D ratio is way too high. And honestly, you can have it, you have a lot more leeway on this end of the spectrum than the other end. Basically, for a 5-inch quad of this mass, Betaflight's default P terms need to be about doubled. Need to be more near the 70s and 80s than down near 40. Because you can see how just taking them from 40 to 30, how we started getting issues. Here, honestly, we're tracking set point really well. But we're getting this up top, and you can kind of see this overshoot up here, but it's not that bad. And honestly, you can't even see this because it's, everything's a blur. You're more concerned with down here, and there's honestly still no bounce back down here. So there's really no overshoot down, and it's following the set point really well. So yeah, what's wrong with this? Well, the issue is you starting to get this. See this this constant overshooting? So that's what you get with the P term being excessively too high. It just keeps, the P term keeps saying, oh, go up, and then the D term's not enough to arrest it, and then, oh, you overshot it, and go down, and it's like you're overcorrecting in a car, or a boat. You just rampantly overcorrecting, which will flare up even worse during prop wash. So it's a little more subtle detection. Even in the video, I struggle to see it. There's a lot of people that don't want to get into Blackbox and all that kind of stuff, and that's great, but you can't really thread that. It's very difficult to me to see some of this stuff without getting in the Blackbox. Here you can clearly see the oscillations. Here you can clearly see the overshoot and oscillations here as well. So I think the best way to see if you have too much P term or where you're at kind of in the mix of it all is, first of all, don't be afraid to go a heck of a lot higher than Betaflight's default. I think for a 5-inch quad, everybody should be probably up in the 60s, 50s, and 60s at least, if not the 70s and 80s. You can do the full roll moves, but you can see bounce back's not a great indicator there, because even at 120, we didn't have a lot of bounce back. But we're having overshoot at the top. So that's one way to look for it, which you can't see in the goggles, so you really need to FPV it. One thing you can do in the field, though, is if you do some sharp move, just like snapping left, snapping right, snapping forward, snapping back, if you have too much P term, you will start to hear it trill. It will go brrrr. So, and what that looks like in a log here is if you go into trace setup 9, again, this is on the roll axis, you can see the PID sum here going up and down and up and down. That's the trilling that you hear. Now, so this is at 120, this is at 86 on the P. So you can see the differential here is not that much. There's still some trilling here, but it's not, obviously as nearly as much as you see over here. So the higher you go on the P term, again, this will get more and more and more. So if you wanted this obviously to be less, you'd lower the P from 86. So we're in that range. This one of these things that I think is kind of funny with PID tuning is, don't be thinking that, oh, bump that up by 2 points. Just go by fives, 85, 86. The only reason this is 86 and 64 is because I found a ratio lower and moved it all up. But honestly, I should just round that off to 86 and 65. I mean, it's ridiculous. The 1 or 2 points is not going to make that much difference. Let's have an example here of what both sound like with the sharp moves, and I'll put that up here next. Now another tool we can use is the PID toolbox, but for the PID toolbox you need to do the correct type of flight. You need to get up and you can just be line of sight, you can do a bunch of flips, you have to do a bunch of rolls, and you have to do some quick jerk moves. You have to do them on the pitch, on the roll, and then on the yaw as well. And that will give it enough data so you can look at sub 500 degrees per second move, and then click this and look at for full 500 degrees per second or over 500 degrees per second moves, which would be the full flips and full rolls. So I'm going to go ahead and roll a clip of what I mean by what type of flight you need to get, and then we'll come back to this.
It's mostly about collecting enough information for the PID toolbox to do its thing, and also for you can look at some spots in the logs themselves, of course. I was going to try to do some prop wash moves back and forth, but you can see I messed up a little bit. Good enough.
So this is the 120 at 45, and then this is the 84 and 68 at 45, and for D term. And you can see there's not that much differential. You can see obviously the overshoot here from the 120, but the vibrations here, it doesn't really look that much different. You can kind of see how there's more oscillation in these traces for the sub 150 or the sub 500. So the sub 500 stuff is me doing those sharp moves left and right like that. And you can see the more oscillations here, less here. So could I come down yet on this? I probably should. That maybe is 84. I'm trying to get a good step response. My rise time here is 17. Here it's 12. We'll have to use feed forward to get to the rest of the way there. So that's something noteworthy. Even with the P term all the way up at 120, so basically a higher P to D ratio. This is D term's 45 here the whole time. I'm still not tracking set point as well as I'd like. And that's where feed forward comes into play. The fact is you can't get a high enough P term without getting trilling and oscillations for prop wash and stuff, but then still track set point. You need something else during a sharp stick move. and that's what we're going to use feed forward for. And then as we increase feed forward, we're probably going to get some overshoot, and that's where we're going to use dmin. We're going to use it as kind of deboost and to make sure we don't get overshoot. Okay, that is it. For now, I'm going to put in my P terms of 85 and 65. I'm going to have my D term again at 45 and 45. Again, we raised the D term to 45 based on what we wanted to have for gains for prop wash, attacking prop wash. So I just picked 45 from past experience. I would say anything between 35 and 45 is a reasonable number. With this quad, it really depends how noisy it is, and just kind of looking at some of the traces with it at 45, I want to kind of keep it there. I want to be able to, bang up and bend up some props and just bend them back. This does have some bent props on it already. I did have a crash that I had to bend to the props back. There's a little nick out of the back ones, which is good for this. So that's kind of limiting me. Obviously, if I put the fresh props on it, I could probably go up to 50, 55, but I think 45 is a reasonable number. And then from there, we're trying to find the gain for P gains. And we just kept moving that up, until it started to trill, and move that down, started looking at the logs, looking at the PID toolbox, things of that nature. You can see at 85 and 65, even if they were at 120, we still weren't tracking set points, so that's where we're going to have to take the next step in the next video, is start using feed forward. A little precursor there, what we're going to do is we're going to put 45 down here, 45 down here. We're going to set this advance to 0. We're going to set this gain to 35. Just based on some experience of mine. This has to do with when these will raise up during prop wash. It sets these to 44 because these are 45. They can't be the same number. So I'll go ahead and I'll take these up to 50. 50 here as well. And then my feed forward gains, I'm going to start. I will probably need, I'm going to go at 250. I will probably need north of 250. That's just based on this experience of mine as well. So that's another thing. People are flying, I believe, in my general experience, unless you have a really light craft, like a racing, no GoPro, super light craft, I believe everybody's P gains are too low. That's why they're not tracking set point well, and they're having bobbles and stuff and all these things you see. Next thing is when you're using feed forward, people are using like 80 to 100, 130. That's way too low. They need to be more like 200, 300. On the one quad, I use 400, 450. So we'll get into that next, but if you want to go ahead, there's the PID tuning guide you can download from tiny.cc /uavtech and start taking a look at that yourself. And as touched upon, here's the guide, which you can download the link I just said. Next step is step 4 here. We actually covered in this video step 2 and step 3 because I just moved up to my D gains to 45 right off the bat and then just kept moving P term up. So that's what this would have did. You could have left the D gains at default and moved D and P up holding the same ratio, but I kind of just did both at the same time. So that's I probably should combine these into one step. I don't know. As always, thanks, and I hope this helped.
Ideas.